Thank you, Nicole. Thank you for anybody that is tuned in on Facebook Live. It's great to have you tune in, and it is really nice that we can reach out in this way. And thanks to everybody who had a hand in setting up the electronic version of this. And then thank you very much to those of you that are here tonight for coming out and braving the pandemic. It is great to see at least the top halves of all of your faces, which I assume are smiling faces under that mask, but I really don't know, right? So if they're not, oh well. So as Jane said, I've worked with the Neenah Historical Society for, 8 years, you said, on 4 different exhibits, and the most recent exhibit that the Historical Society has up is called Tracing Our Paths, Neenah's Immigration Stories. So it's the history of immigration and immigrants in our town in Wisconsin. And so what I want to do tonight is talk a little bit about some of the things that we discovered putting that exhibit together, give you a sense of what would be in it, and really a teaser to have you come out and enjoy it and to tour it if you have not done so already, and I guess if you have done so already, maybe to do it again. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell 3 different stories. So we had any number of people share either their stories or their family stories with us. And I'm just going to pull 3 out from the exhibit, and we're going to talk about them. And what we're going to do is talk about how then those stories illustrate some of the larger and more important themes that came out as we put this exhibit together. One of those themes is, why come to Neenah, right? And this is a question that historians of immigration ask of immigrants to the United States in general. Why are they coming? Why did they come? And there's a question about the pull factor, right? What brought them to the United States, and then to Neenah specifically to make that attractive. And then there's also that push. Why is it that they left wherever they left? And ultimately, one of the things that we found in this exhibit is that over the years, over the generations, people who come to Neenah have come here in search of some sort of stability, to build a stable life. Another really important question that we explored in this exhibit that historians of immigration see as one of their fundamental questions is, how have immigrants adapted to life in their new homeland? And that means individuals, right? How have individuals built a life, succeeded or not? But then also groups, right? How have ethnic and immigrant communities formed and come together? And that's a story of assimilation, of integrating into American life in many ways. But it's also a story of maintaining traditions that come from the home country, and of also building unique ethnic immigrant communities. And so in talking about these 3 folks that we're going to talk about, we'll see these themes coming up over and over again. So the first individual that I want to highlight is Jens Jersel. He's most commonly known as. I've got all kinds of names up there. He's Jens Nels, and he was born Jens Nels Nielsen in 1855, and we'll talk about the names and what went on with the names. So he was born in 1855 in Denmark, and I've dropped a pin in the map where his hometown is, his home village, which is Jersel, Denmark. He was the son of a farmer. I did a lot of the research. We kind of divide the research up, and I did a lot of the research on Jens Jersel. He really is an interesting character. I really kind of came to like him and be quite intrigued by him. I'd actually like to learn a little bit more about him if I ever can. He was seemingly always an ambitious man, an ambitious person, and someone kind of willing to take risks. He was a risk taker in his life. He attended the University of Copenhagen in Denmark, Copenhagen, Denmark. This is a picture of the main building at that university. A recent picture, still stands today. That building was built in the 1870s, so it would have been pretty brand new when Jens started to go to school there. He took courses in theology, in religion. And when he was done with his education there, he was ordained as a Lutheran minister. That's what he was trained to do. Right after he graduated and was ordained, he got married. And he married Laura Jensen, Elizabeth Weiberg, who's pictured here, sitting with the baby in her lap. So that's Laura Jersel. She's with her husband, the other adult in the picture. This is 8 of their children, years down the road. That's not all of them. They had 3 more. They had 11 kids. They went on to have 11 children, 8 of whom are pictured here. They immigrated to the United States 2 days after they got married. So they got married and then they left Denmark and they came to the US. When he got here, when Jens got to America, when he was being registered for where he entered the country, he felt that the name Nielsen, his last name, was too common. So he renamed himself. And he renamed himself in honor of his native village of Jersel. So he becomes Jens Jersel for the rest of his life. Takes on that name. In the same year that he immigrated to the United States, 1884, there was this organization formed in the United States called the Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. It's a church organization. And this Danish Lutheran Church of America followed a particular path of Danish Lutheranism. They were called pietists, was the word that was used. Essentially, it was a practice of Lutheranism that was a little more strict, that was a little more interested in being directly rooted in the Bible and literal interpretations of the Bible than the mainstream Danish Lutheran Church. And that reflected a split in Denmark. So there was the mainstream Lutheran Church, which was a bit more liberal and reformed, and then there were these other folks, these pietists, who wanted to practice sort of a stricter, what they saw as more traditional religion. And so that split was transplanted to the United States, and this more conservative, strict sect formed their U.S. branch in 1884, and then they started importing ministers. They started bringing ministers over that would preach and lead congregations in this way. And so that's why he comes over, I think, among this wave of Danish ministers that's arriving to minister to these new churches in 1884. They first landed in Chicago. He was in Chicago for a little bit where he worked as a minister. And then he became pastor of a church in St. Alban, Minnesota. 5 years later, 1889, he became the pastor at Neenah's Our Savior's Danish Lutheran Church. And it's a congregation of Danes. And there was a Danish community in Neenah. Neenah was sort of at the northern end of this Danish community that had settled along the shores of Lake Winnebago, Neenah in the north stretching south towards Oshkosh. And they attended services at this Danish Lutheran church in town in Neenah here. And he became the pastor there. All of their services were in the Danish language. It's a Danish church. He was an ambitious and an inventive guy and a risk taker, like I said. So in addition to being the pastor of this church, he also started a newspaper. He published a newspaper. He began publishing it in 1892. It was called Danskeren, if I'm pronouncing it right. We've got a picture of its masthead here, its front page, and then a close-up of the masthead. This was the paper that he published, if you can see, right? It says Neenah, Wisconsin, and this issue is from sometime in 1899. It's a Danish language newspaper for Danes in the United States. And in particular, it was the organ of this conservative branch of Danish Lutheranism, which he was associated with. He also started his own publishing company that published Danish language books, got involved in lots of enterprises while he was the pastor. He also started knitting, which is probably something that you know. Eventually that knitting really kind of took off for him, and he started what's called the Jersel Knitting Company, which is a Neenah institution for the better part of a century. The knitting seems to have started with a brother who visited him here and brought a knitting machine, like this one that we're seeing here. I guess that is one of the Jersel knitting machines in the exhibit. And initially the family, because there's a lot of them, right, and they all need to be clothed, start knitting clothes for themselves. And his brother seems to have trained Jens to use this knitting machine, and they knitted clothes for themselves. And then their neighbors and people in the community saw these clothes that they were knitting, liked them, thought they were attractive and warm and practical, and so started asking for Jens and the family to make those on order, which they did. And then eventually this evolved into a manufacturing business that was founded in 1899. And there are still lots and lots of Jersel sweaters around. This is one that was knitted for the University of Chicago. We've got a couple of the sweaters there in the exhibit. He retired, he stepped down from the pulpit, his pastorship, in 1897. Actually 2 years before he even founded the knitting company, because he was already so busy doing knitting on the side and running these various publications. But he stepped down in 1897 from being Neenah's pastorate. But then he continued to work as a minister for the rest of his life. So he went on to operate this very successful large knitting business, manufacturing business. But he volunteered to minister to the Oconto Falls Danish Lutheran congregation. And from 1897, when he stepped down in Neenah, all the way through the year of his death in 1917, he'd get on a train every Saturday night and take the run up to Oconto Falls so he could minister to this Oconto Falls congregation in the morning in the Danish language. So what you see with Jersel, it's really interesting, and I think particularly that theme of adaptation, immigrants adapting to life in the United States. So his story, right, it's the classic American immigrant success story. Right? He came over with very little and established this magnificently successful business. He assimilated into American culture, but at the same time, he was still rooted in a lot of tradition. He was a pillar in the Danish community. He preached in the Danish language every Sunday for the rest of his life. The sweaters that they made were made in the Scandinavian style, right down to his name, right? So for the rest of his life, he carries around, and his sweaters then carried around even after his death, the name of his native village he was honoring. The next individual that I'd like to talk about is Signe Torsteinsdottir Nilsrud. Later became Signe Bame. For a brief period, we've got another issue with names here. She was a Thompson, and we'll get to that. She was born in Valor, Norway. And you can see the pin dropped in it there. It's in the southwestern part of Norway. She's about a generation younger than Jens Jersel, who we were just talking about. She was born in 1888. This is a picture here of Signe, probably in her 20s, most likely taken in the United States after she had arrived in the United States. The nation of Norway is mostly tundra, exposed rock, forest. There's very little good arable land, very little farmland in Norway relative to the size of the nation. And most of that is concentrated in the southwestern part of the country where she was from. So she was from this farming region in Norway. And what happened is the economy really changed in Norway in the late 19th century, around the time that she was born. For one thing, Norway had a huge population increase, and that was due to decreases in infant mortality, better obstetric care for women, so fewer dying in childbirth. So the population shoots up. At the same time, they've still only got this limited amount of farmland. And then what happened was more and more of that farmland was bought up by basically agribusiness farmers looking to grow staple crops that they exported for a profit. So there's very little land to begin with. You've got an increasing population, and then more and more of that land is put into cultivation for exports, for cash crops. And people who would have been small landowners before and grew crops on their land, they lost their land. And then the peasants who didn't own land for a long time in Norway, for centuries, there were common lands that they were able to farm on, and those were privatized and made profitable. So it's unclear where she fit in all of this, and what class her family was and came from. But it's clear that in 1911, at the age of 22, she was a single woman and she needed work. She needed to find work, and she found it in Wisconsin. She came to Wisconsin to work. Oh, yeah, and I got to tell you about this. This is the ship that she arrived on. It's the RMS, British passenger ship, the Olympic. She boarded that ship in June of 1911. She would have picked it up in Cherbourg, France. It was its maiden voyage. It was its very first voyage. And it was notable because of its size. I think when it was put in the water, it was the largest passenger ship at that time in the history of the world. It was a luxury ship, so it was notable, although she wouldn't have been traveling in luxury class, right? She would have been down there in fourth class. The Olympic had a sister ship called the Titanic. The Olympic made her native voyage, steamed into New York Harbor in late June or in early July of 1911. And this is a Library of Congress photo. This isn't even from our collection of the ship coming into New York because it was so notable in its maiden voyage. So she's on there somewhere, right? If you get a magnifying glass, maybe we can pick her out, which is really cool. The Titanic wasn't as fortunate the next year on her maiden voyage. So she comes to New York, and she's processed at the immigration facility in New York on Ellis Island in New York Harbor. And I've got some Library of Congress photos here of Ellis Island, just to give you the kind of sense of what it looked like and how it operated. And then on the right, we've got the text of an article that was published in the Neenah Menashe Daily News Times in 1922. So this would have been about 11 years later. And this article, what it's doing is it's paraphrasing something that a speaker came to Menashe and said. So there was this speaker who came from the outside who said these things. And she came to talk in Menashe about immigration, and particularly about Ellis Island. And she was quite critical of it, the speaker of Ellis Island. And I put that up there for that reason, because when you think about this, right, this had to be a pretty terrifying thing for a 22-year-old single woman to be doing. And the speaker talks about, at Ellis Island, we heard them like cattle, speak to them in an unknown tongue, detain them for hours in an airless, dark room, let them sleep in vermin-infested rooms, dropping down. We have no system of placing them in surroundings where they can feel at home and find work suited to them. We simply herd them in and then forget them except to use them. Right, so this is a scary undertaking. It had to have been for Signe Nielsrud. One thing I don't like about that article and what that woman is saying is she kind of presents the immigrant people as helpless and hapless, right? And so I'm sure it was rough to deal with the whole immigrant journey, to deal with Ellis Island. But they weren't just these hapless people who were kind of drifting around aimlessly. She came with a plan. She came with a destination and some connections. She also changed her name. So at Ellis Island, and it's unclear why, her name was changed from Torstensdatter Nielsrud to Thompson. So she becomes Signe Thompson, which sounds much more American. Whether she chose to do that or whether she was told to do that is unclear. And actually, this really speaks to me, because on my mother's side of the family, he would be my great-grandfather, my mother's paternal grandfather, was also an immigrant from Norway, entered the country at Ellis Island a little earlier than this, and he came in a Christensen with a kind of an exotic Norwegian-style spelling, and he walked out of Ellis Island and Edwards. So my mother grew up as Ann Edwards, but really should have been Ann Christensen, except her grandfather had changed the family name on the way in. So she's got connections, she's got a plan, and that plan was to go to Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and Eau Claire probably had the highest concentration of Norwegian people in the state at the time, and she had a job at a shoe factory. I've done some research on this, and this is just me guesstimating. I've only found evidence of one shoe factory in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, that was in operation at that time, and it was called the A.A. Cutter Shoe Factory. Here's a picture of it. So I'm about 90% sure, unless I'm not aware of another shoe factory that was in operation, that this is where she went to work as a unskilled worker in a shoe factory. She also started doing household work, like domestic work. She apparently was quite a good cook and started cooking in people's homes. And she met members of the Davis family, a prominent family in Eau Claire, who also had well-to-do relatives in Neenah. One of them was William Davis, who visited Eau Claire, met Signe Thompson, her name would have been, and convinced her to come to Neenah, which she did. But this is not a Cinderella story, right, where the handsome prince then marries the servant girl. She met her handsome prince and married him, and that was George Bain, who was the caretaker on that William Davis estate. So she was the cook, he was the caretaker. They met, they fell in love, and they built a life together. So we've got a picture of the two of them. This is probably from around 1920 or so on the left. So Signe Bain is on the far left, her husband George in the center, and this is an unidentified woman on the right so far. They built a life in Neenah. They had 4 sons, 3 of whom lived to adulthood. Here they are pictured with their mother on her 75th birthday in 1963. She was always proud of her Norwegian heritage. And she maintained connections to her family back in Norway. She often took trips there. She did one in the 20s, she did a couple more in the 50s. What we're looking at here, there's an article printed in the News Record, Twin City News Record in 1958 about her trip to Norway in 1958. And she returned there, she visited a couple of her sisters. She also brought back souvenirs, clothes, and things like that. And then she gave a talk and a little presentation about that trip to Norway at Our Savior's Lutheran Church in Neenah. This is Jens Jersel's church, by the way, which I think is really cool. Right? This was the church that he came to be the minister at. Had always done services in Danish. They started doing English services at that church in the 20s, and then they dropped the word Danish from the name in 1930. The church building is also different by the 1950s. In 1956, the new building was built. There's a picture of it there, so it wouldn't be the actual building that Jens Jersel was in, but it's his church, right? The one that he ministered to. And one of the things, if you read that article there, one of the things that she did was she brought children's clothing back and she had her granddaughters model it. And that must have been about the cutest damn thing in the world, right? Just 5 little blonde, Norwegian American girls parading around. I bet they loved it. So Signabane clearly came to Neenah in search of some sort of stability, to build a stable life, right? She had poor economic prospects in Norway. And then she found that stability by way of Eau Claire, eventually in Neenah, where she and her husband George really seem to have built, but to all appearances seems to be a very happy and fulfilling life. Last story that I want to tell here this evening is the story of Zhang Yang. Much more recent story, right? So we think of Neenah's immigrant past, and people like Jersel and Signabane, but Neenah also has an immigrant present, right? Those immigration stories reach right up to our present time. Zhang Yang was born in 1990. He was actually born in Oshkosh. But he is of Hmong descent. His family originated from Laos. In fact, they only arrived in the US in 1989, the year before he was born. The Yang family in Laos got caught up in what is called the Secret War in the 1960s and the 1970s. Basically, his family cooperated with the US military and US intelligence on their operations in Laos. What the US government was doing in Laos was really a couple of things. There was a non-communist Laotian government. There was a communist movement, a militant revolutionary movement trying to overthrow that government in Laos. And the US was trying in the Cold War to stabilize that non-communist government. The other thing that the US was doing is across the border in Vietnam, fighting a major war there. And that war kind of spilled over into Laos as Vietnamese were using it as a transportation route and as a staging ground to attack South Vietnamese and US forces in Vietnam. Among other things, the United States flew 580,000 bombing missions over Laos in the 1960s and the 1970s, dropped an estimated 2 million tons of bombs. And one of the things that Hmong soldiers did in Laos was when these American pilots would go down, they would rescue them. They would protect them. They'd try to keep them out of the hands of communists till they could be delivered back to US forces. This is a picture here of Zhang Yang's father, Por, in the center, and then that's his brother, To, standing at his father's feet in the foreground. In the early 1970s, the United States pulled out of the Vietnam War, and at the same time pulled out of Laos. The Pathet Lao, these Laotian communists, overthrew Laos's government in 1975, and then proceeded to hunt down their enemies of the state, enemies of the Laotian Communist Party. Among them, a lot of Hmong people who had helped the US war effort there, who had supported the old Laotian government. And so you get Hmong people, not just soldiers, but entire villages of men and women and small children that are forced to run for their lives and flee, and they hide out in the jungle as much as they can, avoiding the Pathet Lao and then fighting them when they have to. A lot of them made their way to Thailand, including the Yang family, and then proceeded to live in refugee camps in Thailand. This is the refugee camp that the Yang family lived in. It's an aerial shot of it. This is a picture of 4 of his siblings there. Chow, Mai from left to right, Tong, who was actually born in that refugee camp, and then an older sister, Kia, not pictured here as the brother from the previous slide, who died in that camp. He got a fever and he died in the refugee camp in Thailand. Eventually, the US government recognized the Yang family as refugees and allowed them to come into the United States for asylum. This is 2 pictures of 2 of his siblings, Tong and Mai, that were part of the processing, basically, for refugees and refugee admission. And they're so tiny, and if you look at this picture of the little boy on the left, you see that adult hand coming into the picture, right? Because he's too small to even hold up that sign. We've all dealt with kids that age, right? There's no way he would have kept the thing up long enough for the camera to see it. Whether that's a family member or somebody working for the US administration, we don't know. But it's really this kind, I find it to be this very poignant image. They were admitted into the US. As most refugees, they had to have a sponsor. Zhang Yang had an aunt who had been in the same refugee camp, who had previously been allowed into the United States, and she sponsored this family and brought them to the United States, where they settled in Oshkosh in 1989. Zhang Yang himself was born that next year in 1990, so his family had been in the United States for a year. The family struggled. I mean, they had almost no financial resources when they arrived. They had a lot of difficulty adjusting to American life and culture, especially the language gap was extremely difficult for his parents, he says. One of the proudest moments for the family was both parents became citizens, passed the citizenship test in 2001, and that was a big moment for the family. Zhang Yang graduated from Oshkosh North High School in 2008, and then he went on to Fox Valley Tech, where he studied fire science. 2012, he got a job as a firefighter in La Crosse, and then since 2016, he's been at Neenah Fire Rescue, and is still there today, 5 years later. He is one of only 2 Hmong firefighters in the state of Wisconsin. So the story of the Yang family is unique, right? Every immigrant story is unique. It's also a story that really comes out of the late 20th century and the 21st centuries, and Cold War politics and refugee policy. And it's unique in those ways, but it's also not completely unlike the story of Jens Jersel or Signa Baim or any of the other tens of thousands of foreign-born people who chose to make Neenah their home over the past century and a half. And the Yang family came in search of stability from a dangerously unstable situation, looking for stability. Got here, struggled, and adapted the best they could. And a lot of the story is one of the successive individuals in this family, like Zhang Yang. But it's also a story of maintaining community. So all of the siblings still live in the area and are very close, 9 siblings there were eventually. And they're also a part of a flourishing Hmong community in the region. So this story of the Yangs and the Bames and the Jersels, each one individually is unique, but then they share these common threads with each other and with a lot of other immigrant stories. And together, along with thousands of others, right, who have made the journey, their stories are Neenah's story, right? The story of this town is the story of immigrants who have come here. This is a picture or 3 pictures of the exhibit with members of these families looking at the panels. So we've got Zhang Yang himself with his mother, Zhang Yang, in front of the part of the exhibit that tells his story. We have Signa Bame's granddaughter, Cindy, there looking at her part of the exhibit, and then various descendants and members of the Jersel family, all visiting this exhibit, which I love. I mean, I'm really proud of the work that I've done on this, and I think the Neenah Historical Society did a great job. So like that Jersel family or Cindy Bame or Zhang Yang, that opportunity to see that exhibit is there for you too. I would encourage you, if you haven't seen it yet, to go out and see it, to learn more about these 3 individuals, but then also many other individuals who shared their stories with us. And so I think for a close, I would like to thank those people who did, right? I mean, this is really a kind thing that these people have done to share their stories. So thank you to the Jersel family for sharing their family story, for the Bame family for sharing their family story, and for Zhang Yang and his family, and anybody else who helped us out on the exhibit. So thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it, and come see the exhibit. And I can field questions or respond to comments.
How many of the Jersel live in Neenah now, or the area?
So some of these Jane would probably know better than I, because she's interacted more with those people. So the question is, for those of us on Facebook, how many Jersels are still in the area? And we're thinking...
Well, Carl and Marilyn are the ones that we work with. Carl Jersel, and he was in the photo, and they live in Neenah. His children came for a large family gathering.
Can they hear you?
Go ahead, yeah.
Carl and Marilyn Jersel were the ones. Carl shared his family story with us for the exhibit, and that picture was a family reunion of Carl and their children who were visiting. So I don't think any of the children live in town, but live in the area maybe, or not too far away. So I don't know how many other relatives are still in the area. Of course, their names change. They might have a different last name if it was a daughter,
Yeah.
So. Sorry, that wasn't a great answer to your question. I don't know, basically.
It's more than I knew though, so that's good, thank you. And any other questions or comments or thoughts?
Well, if not, we really appreciate you coming out tonight to learn a little bit more about tracing our paths. And again, we encourage you to come and visit us at the Octagon House, where you can see the full exhibit. There are 9 stories of individuals featured in the exhibit, and I think you'll enjoy each one. So please come and visit us, and thank you again for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, that was great. Loved it.
Good, yeah. Well prepared.
Turn off the Facebook Live.
Yep.
I just
Thanks
thought
a lot
of
for
a question.